A story. Is all right with a story? I read an article about a lady named Donna, and Donna was at her office at Fort Lee. This is where she had been for a little while, and she said she received a phone call from the Pentagon. As the phone rang and she picked it up, and the lady on the other end said who she was and that she was from the Pentagon. In an instant flash, Donna went back 9 months later, remembering that her husband, John, who had been in Iraq, the two soldiers that come to her house at 6:15 in the morning to give her that awful news that her husband had been killed in the line of duty over in Iraq. When she picked up the phone and heard it was the Pentagon, she knew that that's not the way they tell you that someone's died or been wounded in battle. But the first thing that she could think of was her son, Pat, who was still over there in Iraq. And she knew for sure it had something to do with him. As she was drawn back to that 9 months prior, she remembers those soldiers that come to the door at 6:15 in the morning, knocked on the door, and gave her the terrible news about her husband, John. She had the soldiers sit in her living room as she went and got her daughter, Nikki. And they came out, and Nikki was told the terrible news of her dad. Donna began to question them. Simple questions like, what happened? Was there anybody else wounded with him? Was there any survivors? The soldiers could only say a couple of things, and that was, ma'am, we can't tell you that information. Over and over, they said, ma'am, we can't disclose that information. She says, my husband died in the battle, in the war, and all I get is that he died. I want to know the details. I want to know what took place. Was he suffering? Was there pain? Did he die quickly? Just want some simple answers. They said, tomorrow you'll be contacted by the CAO, which the CAO is the Casualty Assistance Officer. He'll come here and he'll be able to answer more of your questions. She said her and John had met in the Army. They were both enlisted in the Army. John was a logistics major, and he was a commander in the Army. She began to go to school to get a degree in logistics. They worked together. They both were in logistics, but he already had his degree and was a commander and out on the battlefield. She stayed home while she got her degree and obviously raised the children, took them to church, took them to school, made sure all the bills were paid. But it was this particular time, 9 months prior, that she had finished her degree. And as she was receiving her degree, John was able to watch and listen via the internet, a live broadcast. And that was the last time that she heard his voice. It was that next day that he was killed in battle. She said that she's the one that prepared all the paperwork with John as they figured out the logistics of it, all the details and everything that he worked on. So she was part of what he did. They both loved logistics. They both loved this career that they had together. Even though she wasn't in the Army anymore, she was as much as part of the Army as she was before. But losing John, she had no reason to go in logistics. She had no reason to grow on in her career, in her field of work, even looking forward to the next day. Without John, that changed her whole life. All of her plans had crumbled. Then there was that obvious help from all the friends, family. You need to move on. You need to go on with your life. And it sounds great. It sounds wonderful until you find out that you don't have the ambition to go on. You don't even have a desire to go on at all because you've lost everything that you live for. Donna said that as her son is in Iraq and Nikki is at home, Nikki's about to go to college. And as she's preparing to move out and move into college, they had moved to Fort Lee. They sold their home, and that would kind of close the memory of living in the house and all the wonderful days they had with John. She needed to forget because it was just destroying her inside, living there and constantly remembering each room and each day of her life that they spent together. It didn't really help when she moved out. They moved to Fort Lee, and she ended up with a job there, and she still was living in depression and loneliness. But she said the thing that bothered her the most was when the CAO, who was supposed to show up the next day, was a day late at the time of her husband's death. And then whenever he walked into the house and they began to fill out paperwork, she began to ask the same question she asked the soldiers prior to that. And he would give her the same answer: I cannot disclose the information. She said, I have served in the army. My husband has served in the army. You've always been a family to us. And this is what we get out of this, is you can't disclose how my husband died. You can't disclose if he had pain and suffering. He says, my job here today is to prepare you for the funeral and to get everything organized and ready. She says, well, when I see the body, at least I'll be able to see what he looked like. And he goes, oh, no, ma'am. I'm sorry. You won't be able to see the body. It's so bad that we decided that it wouldn't be good if you were to see it. Who is the army that would decide for me if I could see my husband or not? She's crying out and saying, who are you to make that decision? And then the conversation continued as he continued to apologize. She goes, we need to pick out a casket at this point. Because I don't care about picking out a casket. I don't care about the things that you're preparing for. I want to see my husband. I want to know the details. I want to know if there was any survivors. Does anybody know what happened that day? The next day, she received an email that said, your husband was killed by a roadside bomb in his Humvee. That was it. She says an email that already tells me what I already know. She was very disappointed, and she says of all the people from the military who was coming to say their condolences, not one person really seemed to care. It's almost like the soldiers that come to the front door, they just needed to do their part and then leave. The CAO who came there just needed to do their part and then leave. And then the people at the funeral, they just needed to say their goodbyes and then leave. And she said, I needed to get help, but nobody was offering me help. I needed to find answers, but no one would give me answers. And then she continued to live in this, and so she finally went to the therapist. And through the military, they provide therapists and psychologists and people to help you, but you never get the same one. You go to the first therapist, then you tell your story, and then you set up another appointment 2 weeks away. And then you go to that therapist because you don't get the same one, and you got to repeat what you repeated already, the entire story, live it over, and explain it to this person. And then once you are done there, they set you up for another appointment, but you go and it's not the same therapist once again. So you have to start all over, going nowhere to get any kind of counseling or closure. After the funeral, the CAO came over and he had stacks of paperwork to fill out now after the funeral. And she would continue to ask questions like, okay, what do I do now? Who's going to pay my mortgage? Where does the money come from? How do I live at this point? Where do I go from here? I don't know what to do. I've never been in this situation, and the CAO could only have these specific questions. Ma'am, I can't answer those questions. I just need to fill out these forms. I need to get your signature here and here and here. She said it was so frustrating to hear that no one seemed to care. She went to Fort Bragg where her son had originally been deployed. And she went in there and she asked questions and she got some answers. But she said that she had to dig and beg and plead for anybody to give her some answers. But she got some answers. But she said the same thing. There was no one there genuinely concerned. No one said, maybe you should go and receive counseling, or maybe you should go to this place and get help, or maybe you should go. No one seemed to care. She then answered the phone for the lady from the Pentagon. And with those rash of thoughts going through her mind about the past and how she just knew this couldn't be good news. The woman on the other end of the phone said, I'm with a committee at the Pentagon who is going to give medals to the children who had soldiers who had been killed in war. And we would like your family to attend. Donna said she was so frustrated. She was so angry that we don't want a medal. This is what you're going to call us and give us? But then she thought about her children. And she said if there's anything that she can do for her children, this would be it. At least it's a start. A memory, maybe. So she agreed to go to the Pentagon. She went to the Pentagon. And she was antsy. She was moving around. So she decided to step out. The meeting hasn't started yet. And she decided to step out. And she looked up and she saw a 4-star general, George Casey Jr. He was the Army Chief of Staff. He looked over at Donna and said, "How are you doing?" She just stared. She saw those 4 stars on his uniform and just said, he genuinely sounds like he cares. And she says, "I'm doing fine. I'm doing okay." And she's trying to walk away. She says, even though I'm not in the Army, I'm still a little intimidated by the 4-star general. She's kind of nervous talking to him. He just listens to her, and she goes, "I'm doing okay, but I'm disappointed in the process. I'm disappointed in the process of what has happened from the time that my husband has died and the type of help that we're receiving." And he said, "I've heard that from several families." Now, whenever I read through the Bible, there's a couple of things that I've lived myself. I've lived it. I understand it. See, Donna was in a place that she could complain and she could tell you what was wrong with the system. I remember that when I was growing up as a kid, and I truly believe that God calls us as children. I've spoken to many missionaries who have been called just as in elementary school, junior high. God has spoke to them and said, you're going to be a missionary. You're going to be a leader. You're going to be a pastor. As I was walking from school one day, I remember the conversation in Avondale. It's in Birmingham, Alabama. You probably wouldn't know Avondale. It's a small little city. And I remember complaining to God, looking up at the sky as I was walking home, disappointed in the fact that the church was so boring for me. And I complained to him, why doesn't anybody do anything? Why don't they get out there and find the youth? Why don't these adults that come to the church, why don't they go out there and start programs for the youth so we can get involved? And then why don't they, that word they, why don't they get involved? See, you always got to figure out, who are they? When we say they, see, now I think back and I remember why our church didn't grow. My dad went to this one church and there was only one member in that church. And then he took that and grew it to 20 or 30, but they were not devoted Christians. Their lifestyle was still living that simple lifestyle, but they would show up on Sunday because that's the thing that you would do on Sunday in the South. You go to church. But as soon as you walk out those doors, you're back into party town. You're back living the same life, and that's why. But I didn't know that as a child. I thought everybody that was in the church was a Christian, a believer, on fire for God, ready to build the church. But I was disappointed. And then when I say they, and I start thinking bigger than the church that I'm in, when I start thinking they should do something, I start thinking we were with the Wesleyan Church and the Church of the Nazarene. And as I grew up, the Church of the Nazarene, we know the headquarters is in Kansas City. And I would think this as I was growing up years later was, why doesn't Kansas City do anything? Why don't they produce events and activities and things that would just surround all of our churches and bring the youth to them? Things that would draw the youth in to hear the gospel, to build the church. I can't do it. I'm a kid. I can't do it. I don't have the money. I can't do it because of all the other excuses I have, but they can do it. And then I read this story in 1 Kings 17. This is the story of Elijah. As God had led him first to talk to Ahab and say, there's going to be a drought, there's not going to be rain. And then obviously if there's no rain, there's no food. The animals will die, the people begin to die because of lack of water. But then also means the plants begin to die. So there's not going to be a lot of food. And for these years, there would be a lack of food and water. Be very slim. We had sent Elijah out to a riverbed, a small stream, where he was supplied with water, but eventually that water dried up. And he told Elijah, go down to the gates of the city, and whenever you get there, this widowed woman is going to provide for you. It says in 1 Kings 17, then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was gathering sticks. And he called to her and says, please give me a little water in a jar that I may drink. As she was going to get it, he called to her and says, please bring me a piece of bread from your hand. But she said, as the Lord your God lives, I have no bread. Only a handful of flour in a bowl and a little oil in a jar. Behold, I am gathering a few sticks that I may go and prepare for me and my son, that we may eat and die. This widow woman was so poor that she only had a little bit of flour left, And she was out there gathering sticks so she could make a fire to cook the flour with the water and make a little bit of bread, which is not going to be a lot. And then she says, after this meal, after we've eaten this is our last meal. We have no more flour. We have no more food. We have nothing. We are going to eat our last meal together. And then I know the result after this. We are going to die. Could you imagine being Elijah? Where that promise from God was, go to this widowed woman, she'll meet you at the gate, and then she's going to provide for you. And you get there, and you see the widowed woman, and you think, woo, rescued. And the first thing she says is, oh, this is all I got, and we're going to die. It's that moment that Elijah speaks to this woman and sees this. There's a few things that you could do in this situation. But Elijah knew what to do. Elijah, being a man of God, knowing that God had promised that this woman would be able to provide food and water. Elijah said to her, do not fear. Go, do as you have said, but make me a little bread cake from it first, and bring it out to me, and afterward you may make one for yourself and your son. Now you got to picture the woman on the other side. Saying, are you crazy? I just told you I barely have enough for me and my son, and now you are being so greedy. Not only do you want me to make you one out of our last meal, but you also want me to bring it to you first, so you get to eat first. But that's not the conversation at all. She said, okay. There's a promise that Elijah is going to give her. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bowl of flour shall not be exhausted, nor shall the jar of the oil empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain to the face of the earth. So she went and did according to the word of Elijah. This woman had nothing. She had nothing. She could not save the life of Elijah. But yet at the word of Elijah and the promise that he gave from God, she obeyed and she went with the little bit that she had and she brought it. Now the significance, if you don't understand the Bible and why it was very significant, that she brings it first to Elijah. Elijah is a prophet of God. So he represents the living God. He's not God, but he represents God. So by her bringing the food to him first, represented what we consider tithing, and also through the law where they were to bring their first fruits. And it's telling her, yes, you are going to have your portion, but bring the first portion to God. And as soon as she did that, she showed that she was dedicated to doing the will of Elijah, who was doing the will of God. And she was willing to take this chance with this new Lord, this new Savior that she had just been told about. She lived in a place that worshipped idols, so the chances that she believed in the same God that Elijah believed in is very slim. In fact, she keeps continually saying, your God, your God, your God, meaning that's his God. And obviously her life is about to change. See, she could have easily said, I wish somebody would take care of you. I wish that somebody would provide for you. I hope that somebody does. I hope that somebody cares enough to give you their last meal, but me and my son, we don't have enough to help anybody. But that's not what she did. She trusted in the Lord that Elijah believed in. She trusted in the words that Elijah had said. And she went with the little bit that she had. And just as God promised, the flour and the oil never ran out. In the book of Matthew, we hear the words of Jesus. It's in Matthew 14, starting at verse 13. Jesus had been out doing miracles and a lot of works, and people were following him. Crowds, thousands among thousands. And in this story, there was over 5,000. We count the men. At least they did in that day. They count the men. So this doesn't include women and children. So there was at least 5,000 men, and that in addition to that is going to be women and children. And then it's getting late. They're a long ways from town where they can get food. If we were here, we'd be a long way from Stater Brothers or Food for Less or Albertsons, wherever you go shopping. So you're too far away to go get food. So the disciples were concerned about this, and so was Jesus. And in verse 13 of Matthew 14, starting at verse 13, when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him. So all these people are following wherever he goes. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion for them, and he healed their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late. So send the crowds away, that they may go in the villages, buy food for themselves." The disciples are doing what I did as a child, what many of you have done, what maybe most churches do today. Send them away and let them go provide for themselves. I hope that somebody does something. I really hope that somebody will step in and fix this. Well, there's videos on YouTube that you can watch where people have videotaped someone being in a fight or somebody getting hurt, hit by a car even, and people don't even stop to help. They're so busy, they just walk on by. I hope somebody helps them. When the disciples came to Jesus, said, let's send them away so they can go get help, so they can go get food. Give them enough time to get back into town. Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." Now you go back to the widowed woman back in the Old Testament in the book of 1 Kings. That's fairly similar. Well, the lady's about to die, and it's like, hey, you feed the prophet. Who, me? These disciples see thousands of people. He's like, you feed them. Man, I'd be pulling out my wallet and all my credit cards and everything, saying, dude, my credit card has a limit on it, and it's not going to feed all these people. The cash that I have in my pants pocket is not enough to buy enough bread for everybody. And I would be just like the disciples. I mean, they're sitting there looking at each other going, what are we going to do now? For one, how do you say no to Jesus? And for another, how do you feel if you don't know how to answer him? They said to him, "We have here 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Ordering the people to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food, breaking the loaves. He gave them to the disciples. You hear that? He took the loaves and he gave them to the disciples. Did Jesus go out to the people and give it to the people? No. He gave it to the disciples. It's so important if you hear Jesus speaking to you that, yes, Jesus can go out there and give it to them. Yes, Jesus could have said, all right, you guys sit here, let me go do all the work. But that's not what he did. He allowed them to be part of this history-making miracle that is about to take place. This amazing story that is going to influence people down the line for generations and generations. We today still read this story because it's so phenomenal. More sermons and upon sermons and sermons have been told about this because it's amazing what happens. That there is just this little bit of bread and a few fish. And Jesus was able to feed so many. He says, ordering the people to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Looking up to heaven, he blessed the food, and breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowd. You, all of you, are the part of the body of Christ. Each one of us has a job to do, and God is not trying to push you away and say, okay, I'll handle it myself. He's saying, you are part of this body. I'm going to do the work. I'm going to do the miracles. I'm going to do the blessing. I'm going to pass it on to you. You are going to take it and bless the people that I've told you to bless. And that's what he did with the disciples. He took the food that they had, the little bit that they had, he took it, he blessed it, he multiplied it, he gave it back to them. They took it and gave to the people. That's what we do in the church. It doesn't matter what I have. It doesn't matter what I own. It doesn't matter about the mind, the knowledge that I have. If I just give everything that I have over to God and say, God, here it is. He will bless it. He will multiply it. And he'll say, now go out and use it. It says this. The disciples gave to the crowds, and they all ate and were satisfied. They picked up what was left, and it was over the broken pieces. There was 12 full baskets of leftovers. There was about 5,000 men who ate, besides women and children. Can you imagine being that disciple that right before this had no clue the power of Jesus Christ? Jesus allowed them to see the issue that they had at hand. There's over 5,000 people here. They're hungry. He allowed them to see. He also allowed them to feel the pain for them. They need to be able to leave here and go out and eat. Jesus, stop doing so many miracles so they can go home. Send them away. Otherwise, they're going to stay here, and then we can't feed them. Jesus allowed them to see it, and then he allowed them to be part of the answer. Bring what you have to me. And they did. And then he blessed it. And then it was enough to go out and provide for the masses. I remember growing up as a kid and yelling at the Jesus, why don't you help the church? Why don't you make them get involved? Why don't you make those people do something? Those people in Kansas City, those people sitting in the pews, why don't you make them do something? Inspire them or something. And then it was that day that I was driving by Disneyland, and I looked over and saw the convention center. And obviously the convention center is not where we ended up when we began this ministry. But it took that big sign that had this big bold phone number on it, saying for your next event, call this number. And it was like God speaking to me from a question that I asked him as I was a kid. And it's saying, here's the answer. Call that number. I called that number, and the lady said, yeah, this is how much it'll cost to rent out the convention center. Because I thought, if we can just rent out a convention center, do an event, bring in the lost, teach and preach about Jesus Christ, people are going to get saved. The churches will begin to be active and involved. We can reach people. Like I said, we didn't end up there. We ended up at the Rose Bowl Stadium. But what God was saying to me was, you've been complaining since you were a kid about going out there and doing something. Well, stop saying, should they do something, and should they do something, and should they do something, and you go do something. And he showed me how I can do something, but not by my own power, not by my own might, but through his power and his might. And it was a huge difference. All of a sudden, I was able to do things that I couldn't afford to do. All of a sudden, I was able to reach people that I could never reach before. And today, Today, because of that, we've reached over about 30,000 people. Actually, I think it's over 30,000 now. We were in the 29,000 something just last week. So about 30,000 people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. With this little small ministry, with a little bitty complaint that I had as a kid. And it's not because of me, and it's not because of you. It's because of the amazing power of Jesus Christ. And he's not done with us yet. But there's something in each one of you, and there's a desire in each one of you that have a complaint about something. You have a complaint about why something's not working the way it should. You have a complaint about why things aren't working out, and you just keep whining to God, or you whine to your superiors or whoever. You just keep complaining and complaining. You know what? That may be God putting it on your heart so much that he's saying to you, why don't you do something? Because obviously, you're the one that cares. The desire is in your heart. And he says, if you'll just go do something, I'll back you up. I'll walk before you. I'll make the path straight. I'll open the doors that you need to be opened. Just as Donna was going in and asking all these questions and trying to get answers, and she finally, at the face-to-face with the 4-star general, the chief of staff of the army, as nervous as she was, she stands before him, and he goes, how are you doing, Donna? And she goes, I'm doing okay now. How's everything going? It's all right, but I'm disappointed in the way this whole process works. The disappointment of no one cares, no counseling, no. And she continued to list all the things that happened, from the 2 soldiers that showed up at her door to the CAO who came in there and had her fill out paperwork and could care less. How long it took to get a therapist. Weeks before she could see a therapist. She said, I had to wait weeks. My husband has died, and they're going to tell me that the next appointment they have is almost a month away. The army treats us like they do not care. He says, I've heard that from several families in the same situation. And he says, because of that, I've began a committee that is going to be overseeing that and looking into all the things that happen in this kind of situation. She said she stared right at him. She says, good luck with that. If you don't understand something, start a committee. That's great. She felt as let down at that moment as she has the whole entire time. What's a committee going to do? They're going there and shuffle papers. They're going to make notes. She began to say goodbye, to go back into the award ceremony. And she turned to walk away, and he goes, Donna? Yes? Because I said I was going to, we're already working on this and putting together a committee. So that I want you to be on that committee. She said, even as a civilian, she can't say no to a 4-star general. The committee began to contact the families that soldiers had died in war. And she began, along with the committee, they began to find resources for them. They began to give them list of doctors they can go see, list of therapists, financial assistance. They began to find all the resources and providing them and helping them through this tragedy that they went through. She said that once she was on this committee, she found out that even though she had questioned God this entire time, she's like, where is God in all of this? She said, God had prepared me for this day. She allowed my husband and I to get so caught up into logistics that I learned how to do paperwork. I learned how to search out things. I learned how to put things in order. But she also said, I also learned how to go through tragedy. I lost my husband. I knew what it felt like to be disowned and cast to the side. She knows I felt those feelings that nobody cared. I also knew what it felt like to go to a doctor and they say, hey, we have an appointment weeks down the line. She goes, I knew what it felt like, and God had been walking me through this so that I now have purpose in my life. She stopped saying, I hope somebody fixes it. I hope somebody will change the system. And now she was on the committee that had the power to make the changes. They come up with one of their biggest successes is SOS, which is called Surviving Outreach Services. And that's where they refer people to the doctors and the therapists and the financial planners and the life coaches. And it lasts as long as the person still needs them. It's a never-ending support of the families that have lost loved ones, soldiers, in the war. She said, it's funny how God set her up in logistics, and she was able to get a degree, and then to not think that she would be able to work, she didn't even have a desire anymore to do logistics. But she said God had called her to such a high calling, and she goes, for her, the highest calling was to do logistics of the heart and of the soul. That's her new title that she feels that God has given her to be able to reach out and help heal the hearts and souls of people who are lost and lonely and hurting. There's somebody in our midst, maybe on YouTube, maybe people you know. They complain, they whine, they say, why doesn't somebody do this? Well, that might be God talking to you and you trying to pass it on to somebody else. Just like it was for me, just like it was for others in the ministry, God speaks to us. And sometimes we don't know how to handle it. It's so hard on our heart that it's such a burden that we want somebody to do something, but we don't know who to call. We don't know who to reach out to say, hey, why don't you get up and do it? And the whole time, God is preparing you to be the one to go out and lead the cause. It doesn't mean that you have to provide all the stuff that goes along with it. If he needed a detailed person, he sure wouldn't have called me. All he wanted me to do was get the ball rolling, and then he provides the people to support me and help me. And he provides the open doors, and he provides the path. He provides the direction. And that's why we can say, how many people have we reached with the gospel of Jesus Christ? Over 30,000 people. And that's not even including the YouTube videos. That's not including other outreaches. That's just our outreach that we have going right here in our own backyard. Imagine what God will do if you will say, okay, God, I hear you calling me. I'm ready.